The topic that we are going to discuss today is aggregate supply. Before going into the details, let's first look at the definitions and the difference between short run and the long run and all that. So, this is how the term is defined. So, the aggregate supply is basically the total amount of goods and services that all industries in an economy will produce at every given price level. And it is basically the sum of all supply curves of all industries in an economy. So it's basically the total amount of goods and services produced by every single firm or every single industry in the economy. If you add up all these output by all the firms and all the industries, what you get is the aggregate supply. Um, so before we go into the other details, we need to understand the difference between short run and long run, because you have short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply. So before we understand all these things, we need to understand the difference between short run and long run. We know the difference between short run and long run in microeconomics. Likewise, here also we need to understand what distinguishes between short run and long run. So short run is a period when prices of factors of production, which is nothing but factor payments, do not change. When the prices of factors of production do not change, then that period of time is known as short run. And in the long run, prices of all factors of production change. So this is how we differentiate between short run and long run. uh, for example, when the price of labor, which is wage, if it is constant, and price of capital, which is interest, if that is also constant, then we can understand that we are in short run. And when these prices of factors of production change, then we move into the long run. Okay. So we know that prices of factors of production or factor payments do not change in the short run, but then we need to understand why they don't change. They don't change because of these reasons. Um, in any country or in any firm, you have labor contracts fixing wage rate. For example, if I'm getting a job in a particular place, I get um, I get this job offer where my salary is specified, and this salary is constant for a period of time, at least for 6 months or 1 year of time. So during this 6 months or 1 year, my wage is constant. So only after that my performance will be assessed and my salary will be increased depending upon my performance. So that is nothing but the labor contracts. So these labor contracts basically fix the wage rate for any labor during a particular period of time. So that's one thing, that why in the short run prices of factors of production do not change. And the other thing could be minimum wage legislation fixing the wage. So government in most of the countries fix minimum wage, and this minimum wage is there for certain years or certain period of time. So during that period, nobody will be paying the wage below the minimum wage. In most of the cases, they don't pay higher than minimum wage, but then they cannot pay the wage which is below the minimum wage fixed by the government. And the other reason could be workers' labor unions are resisting wage cuts. Let's say there is a deep recession in an economy, and companies are making losses and all that, and then they want to cut down the wage to survive in the market. But then that will face a severe resistance from labor union, worker unions, and all that, because when their salary is reduced or when their wage is reduced, they are going to suffer. And in most of the cases, nobody would like to have a wage cut or pay cut. So that's another reason why wages do not change in the short run. And the next one is wage cuts or pay cut will also affect the workers morale. So if somebody's wage is reduced or somebody's salary is reduced, that's going to demotivate that worker or that person. So that will affect the productivity of the firm, and if that happens to most of the workers, then the entire firm or the entire company's productivity will go down, and their business eventually will go down. So in order to avoid that, most of the firms will avoid a wage cut, because that's going to affect firms motivation. It's going to demotivate workers and it will affect the productivity. So these are the reasons why prices of factors of production, especially wage, which is price of labor, is constant in the short run and they don't change. um, okay, so let's first look at short run aggregate supply. uh, so because we have discussed the supply curve in microeconomics, let's first recall this particular concept, and then we can try to understand the similarity between supply curve in microeconomics and supply curve in macroeconomics. If you have understood supply curve in microeconomics, it's very easy to understand supply curve or short run aggregate supply curve in macroeconomics. So supply curve in microeconomics basically shows a relationship between price and quantity supply. It basically shows positive relationship, and any change in the price of good will lead to movement along the supply curve, from point A in the supply curve to point B in supply curve. We'll be moving along the same supply curve. So that will happen when there is a change in price of good. When there are changes in factors other than price of good, which is also known as non-price factors, in this case there will be a shift in supply curve either to the left or to the right. So in the case of price factor, you have movement along the supply curve, and in the case of non-price factors, you will have shift in supply curve. The same thing is applicable in macroeconomic situation also. So in the case of SRAS in macroeconomics, uh, this curve, the SRAS curve, basically shows the relationship between price level and total output, which is nothing but real GDP in an economy. So in microeconomics, we just add price of the good, but here in macroeconomics, we look at the total output produced in an economy. Therefore, we don't have price of one single good. Instead, we have price level, average price level in the economy, and instead of quantity supplied, we have total output, which is nothing but real GDP in an economy. So like in microeconomics, here also any change in the price level in the economy will lead to movement along short run aggregate supply. Likewise, any change in non-price factors or factors other than price level will lead to shift in short run aggregate supply either to the left or to the right. So this is basically the short run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping. So here in vertical axis you have price level, and in horizontal axis you have real output or real GDP in an economy. So this PL1 is price level 1, and at this price level, this is Y1 is the real GDP produced in the economy. And when the price level increases from PL1 to PL2, the real GDP increases from Y1 to Y2. So we move, if this point is A, we move from point A to point B when there is increase in price level. Okay, so to sum it up, the higher the price, the greater the real GDP, and vice versa. Lower the price level, lower the GDP. Okay. Why short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping? Because at higher price level, firms will make higher profit, and they eventually will increase their output. When this is happening in the entire economy at a higher price level, most of the firms in the economy will be making higher profit, and they will all increase their output. So this will lead to a situation where the country's total output is increasing. So higher profit for firms at higher price level. Just consider this case because we are in the short run. Prices of factors of production, FOP here means factors of production, especially the wage. So let's consider the case of wage here, which is price of labor. Um, because we are in the short run, so what we understand is that price of factors of production do not change, and so we understand that the wage is constant in the short run, and therefore the cost of production, COP here means cost of production, so the cost of production also is constant. So on the one hand you have constant cost of production, but on the other hand, if the price of goods and services is increasing, what will happen? You have higher profit. That's because on the one hand you have constant cost of production, on the other hand the price of your good that you are selling in the market is increasing. So this will lead to a situation where you are making higher profit. So higher profit will motivate you to supply more, and when this is happening across the economy, what will happen is this. So at a higher price level, when the price level increases from PL1 to PL2, firms will make higher profit. Eventually they will increase their output. Most of the firms in the economy will increase their output from Y1 to Y2. So this is the reason the short run aggregate supply is upward sloping, and this you can understand because you have already understood the supply curve in microeconomics. Okay, so this diagram again explains what's happening when there is a increase or decrease in the price level. So when the price level increases from P1 to P2, so the real GDP increases from Y1 to Y2, and this is known as expansion of aggregate supply. And when the price level decreases from P1 to P3, the real GDP decreases from Y1 to Y3 because of lower profit at a lower price level. And this is nothing but contraction of aggregate supply. Okay. Um, so like in microeconomics, we also have shifts in short-run aggregate supply in macroeconomics as well. So here what is happening, the supply curve, aggregate supply is increasing, shifting from AS1 to AS3, which is rightward shift or increase in aggregate supply. And when the aggregate supply is moving from AS1 to shifting from AS1 to AS2, that's basically the leftward shift where the aggregate supply is decreasing. So here you have to understand one thing, that when there is a shift in aggregate supply, the price level remains the same. The only change that is happening is the real GDP, change in the level of real GDP. For example, here the price level remains at GPL1 and this is general price level. So this price level remains the same, but then when there is a rightward shift, what is happening, or when there is an increase in the aggregate supply, the real GDP increases from Y1 to Y3, and when there is a leftward shift in aggregate supply, the real GDP decreases from Y1 to Y2. So at the same price level we have changes in real GDP, either increasing or decreasing. Okay. So when you look at this shift in short-run aggregate supply, what you understand is SRAS will shift in the following cases. The first one, changes in wage, interest, rent. So basically, when there is a change in the price of factors of production, which is wage, interest, and rent, and all that, when when there are changes in these factor prices, this will cause changes in the cost of production. For example, if the wage is increasing, that's going to increase the cost of production of firms. Likewise, when there is increase in interest rate or when there is increase in rent, that's going to affect the cost of production. So that will eventually shift this short-term aggregate supply. either to the left or to the right, depending upon whether there is increase or decrease in these prices of factors of production. For example, if there is increase in wage, which is wage is the price of labor. When there is increase in wage, there is increase in cost of production. So this cost of production leads to decrease in firm's supply, because when the cost of production increases, so firm's profit level will decrease, and at a lower profit level firms will supply less. So the next one is changes in the prices of raw material. um, for example, cotton is raw material in textile firms, and crude oil is also considered as raw material, because crude oil is used to bring to transport raw material from one place to another place. So whenever there are changes in the prices of raw materials such as oil, cotton, etc., so this will change the cost of production of firms, and which in turn will affect the supply of firms. For example, if there is a increase in the price of steel, which is the main raw material used in automobile companies, so there will be increase in cost of production in these companies, and that will decrease the supply of firms, because higher cost of production means lower profit for these firms. So they will decrease the supply of their products, and eventually what you will have is leftward shift of shorten aggregate supply. Okay, so the next one is supply shocks. So whenever there is a supply shocks, what will happen? The shorten aggregate supply will shift to the left. The supply will be very less, and there will be leftward shift of shorten aggregate supply. For example, the present lockdown due to COVID-19 means there is a decrease in supply of firms across the country. So which means there is a leftward shift in shorten aggregate supply. Okay. The other factors that will cause shift in shorten aggregate supply is subsidies and taxes. Um, so subsidies, for example, here higher subsidies means the lower cost of production. When the government is giving more subsidies to firms, their firms' cost of production will decrease, and so lower cost of production means higher profit. So firms will increase the supply, and there will be a rightward shift of SRAS. Likewise, in the case of taxes, when the government is decreasing the tax, recently the government reduced corporate tax in India. So, corporate tax is nothing but the tax paid on firms' profits. So, when they have to pay lesser corporate tax, they retain more profit, which means they will reinvest this profit in their business, and that will increase the aggregate supply in the country, and that is likely to shift the aggregate supply, shorten aggregate supply to the right. So this cut in corporate tax in India will decrease firms' cost of production, and that will lead to rightward shift of shorten aggregate supply like this. So here there is a movement from okay, so this should be SRAS 1 and this should be SRAS 2. So at this price level, so we move from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2, and eventually what is happening is the real GDP is increasing from Y1 to Y2. Okay, so that's about the short-run aggregate supply. So we discussed what is short-run aggregate supply and what are the factors that cause shift in short-run aggregate supply, and we also looked at movement along the short-run aggregate supply and all that.